She boarded the flight, cradling her baby, exhausted but relieved that she was finally headed home. The cabin buzzed with polite chatter, until a sharp voice cut through the air. The flight attendant's eyes narrowed, scanning her from head to toe with a look that spoke volumes. "You don't belong here." What started as whispered remarks turned into something no one could have imagined. Passengers froze. A baby cried. And then a slap echoed through the cabin. Gasps filled the air as her head jerked sideways. But the flight attendant had just made a fatal mistake, because the man who owned the entire airline was watching. And he wasn't just any man. He was her husband. The airport terminal buzzed with energy as travelers hurried to their gates, dragging rolling suitcases and clutching passports like lifelines. Among the chaos, a young black mother named Amara gently rocked her infant daughter against her chest. Her face showed traces of exhaustion, but her eyes carried a quiet strength. She had learned long ago that life rarely gave second chances, so she clung to the moments that mattered, like getting home safely with her baby in her arms. It had been a long trip, a mix of business and personal commitments that left her drained. Her baby whimpered softly, and Amara whispered soothing words, adjusting the small pink blanket that smelled faintly of lavender. She had purchased a first-class ticket, a small luxury she'd allowed herself for comfort during the long flight. After all, traveling alone with an infant was no easy task. As she approached the boarding gate, she noticed a few curious stares. People often stared, sometimes with admiration, sometimes with judgment. Amara had learned to ignore them, but something about the way the flight attendant at the gate looked at her made her stomach tighten. It wasn't curiosity. It was something colder. A smirk danced at the edge of the woman's lips as her eyes flicked from Amara's designer diaper bag to the baby in her arms, then back up with an expression that said, "Really? You? First class?" Amara smiled politely, presenting her boarding pass. The attendant's greeting was clipped, professional on the surface, but laced with something that felt sharp, dismissive. "Gate 3A, first-class cabin," she said without making eye contact. Amara thanked her softly and walked down the jet bridge. Inside the aircraft, the first-class section gleamed with plush leather seats, glossy wood accents, and chilled champagne waiting on polished trays. Amara took a deep breath of relief. Finally, a bit of peace for herself and her baby. She settled into her seat, placing the diaper bag neatly at her feet, and gave her daughter a tiny bottle of milk. The baby latched eagerly, little fists waving in the air, and Amara felt her shoulders relax for the first time in hours. The other first-class passengers began trickling in. Business executives, a wealthy couple adorned in diamonds, a celebrity, whose face was hidden behind oversized sunglasses. No one paid much attention to her at first, and she preferred it that way. She wanted this flight to be uneventful, smooth, and quiet. But life rarely works that way. The first sign of trouble came when a flight attendant swept down the aisle with the crisp authority of someone who believed the cabin was her kingdom. Her name tag read Tiffany. She was tall, perfectly groomed, and carried herself like she owned the skies. Her eyes landed on Amara and lingered. Tiffany's gaze was cool, calculated, the kind that stripped a person down to assumptions. She glanced at the baby, then at Amara's seat. "Ma'am," she said, her tone already edged with irritation, "are you sure you're in the right section?" Amara blinked, caught off guard. "Yes," she replied softly, holding up her boarding pass. Tiffany took it without asking, scanned it, then handed it back without apology. She murmured, her lips curling slightly before she turned away. Amara swallowed hard. She told herself to let it go. People like that weren't worth her energy. She focused on her baby, who had now fallen asleep, her tiny chest rising and falling against Amara's heart. The aircraft doors closed, and the safety announcements began. Tiffany reappeared, gliding past Amara's seat with that same judgmental look, as if daring her to step out of line. Amara felt her cheeks burn, but she stayed silent. The last thing she wanted was a confrontation, but the tension didn't stop there. As the flight took off and the cabin lights dimmed, Tiffany returned, this time with a tray of drinks. She served champagne to the man across the aisle, wine to the couple behind Amara, then stopped abruptly in front of her. Tiffany tilted her head. "We don't usually allow babies in first class," she said under her breath, her voice sugary sweet but laced with venom. Amara froze. "Excuse me?" she whispered, careful not to wake her baby. Tiffany leaned in, her perfume sharp in the air. "This is a premium cabin. People pay for peace and quiet, not this," she said, glancing at the sleeping infant. Then, with a bright smile for the passengers nearby, she straightened and walked off, leaving Amara stunned, heart pounding in her chest. The whispers began soon after. 2 passengers exchanged glances. A man chuckled softly behind his hand. Amara felt the sting of humiliation creep up her spine. She kept her eyes fixed on the seat back in front of her, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted the blanket around her daughter. She didn't know it yet, but this was only the beginning. The hum of the engines blended with the soft murmur of conversation as the plane leveled off at cruising altitude. Amara took a slow breath, adjusting her baby's blanket once more, trying to anchor herself in the moment. "Just get through the flight," she told herself. "Ignore her. Ignore everyone." But the whispers didn't stop. She could feel them like tiny pricks against her skin. The quick glances, the amused smirks, the quiet snickers that people thought she couldn't hear. Her hands tightened in her lap. She wasn't imagining this. They were laughing. At her. Tiffany returned, gliding down the aisle like a runway model, her lips painted a sharp shade of red. In her hands, a tray of sparkling champagne flutes gleamed under the cabin lights. She stopped by Amara's seat, holding the tray just out of reach. "Would you like water?" Tiffany asked, her tone dripping with insincerity, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "I mean, obviously champagne isn't really suitable for someone in your condition." Amara's brows furrowed. "Condition?" Her baby stirred slightly, sensing her mother's tension. "Water is fine," she said quietly, refusing to rise to the bait. Tiffany placed a glass of water on her tray table with exaggerated care, as though performing a charitable act. But she didn't leave. She lingered. "You know," Tiffany continued, her voice all sweetness and poison. "First class is designed for guests who value a certain level of sophistication, peace, comfort. Not—" Her eyes dropped deliberately to the baby now nestled against Amara's chest. "This sort of disruption." Amara felt her throat tighten. The injustice of it burned through her, but she swallowed the words clawing at her throat. Confrontation would only make things worse, and the last thing she wanted was to wake her baby into a storm. She nodded politely instead, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Tiffany's lips curved in a triumphant smirk before she turned away, swaying down the aisle as though she had won a battle. Amara sat frozen, her heart pounding. Around her, passengers pretended not to watch, but their sidelong glances told another story. One man whispered something to his seatmate, and they both chuckled softly. A woman in pearls arched a brow, lips twitching in suppressed amusement. Amara's cheeks flamed. Her baby let out a tiny sigh, curling deeper into her mother's warmth, blissfully unaware of the cruelty simmering in the air. Amara stroked the infant's soft cheek, grounding herself in the small comfort of that innocent presence. Minutes crawled by, heavy and suffocating. Just when she thought it might be over, Tiffany struck again. This time she returned with a small cart and a smile, so bright it looked like it might crack her face. She began serving meals, her tone honeyed as she addressed the other passengers. "Lobster thermidor for you, sir. Filet mignon for you, ma'am. Oh, and a special dessert for our VIP guest." Her laughter tinkled like glass as she set a tray before the man across from Amara, a silver-haired executive in an expensive suit who grinned like a cat in cream. When Tiffany reached Amara, her expression shifted. The smile remained, but her eyes gleamed with malice. She set a tray down with unnecessary force, the dishes rattling. "And for you," she paused theatrically, drawing the attention of half the cabin. "Something simple, since we wouldn't want to overwhelm you." Amara stared at the plate. It was a plain salad, no dressing, no garnish. Her chest constricted, humiliation clawing at her throat. She could feel the passengers watching, their curiosity sharp as knives. Tiffany tilted her head, feigning innocence. "Oh dear," she purred. "I hope that's acceptable?" Amara's mouth opened, but no sound came. What could she say? If she objected, it would only fuel Tiffany's performance. Her silence became its own form of surrender. She dropped her gaze, blinking rapidly as heat pricked her eyes. Tiffany's smile widened. "Wonderful," she chirped and glided away, her perfume lingering like smoke. The salad sat untouched. Amara had no appetite, only a gnawing ache in her chest that threatened to spill over. She forced herself to breathe, to focus on her daughter, who slept peacefully, unaware of the storm raging around them. "Just get through this," she repeated. "Just get home." But the storm wasn't done. Hours into the flight, turbulence rocked the cabin. The lights flickered, and the plane shuddered before steadying. Gasps rippled through the passengers. Amara tightened her grip on her baby, whispering soothing words as the infant whimpered. Softly, she kissed her daughter's forehead, murmuring a lullaby under her breath. That was when Tiffany appeared again, eyes sharp, smile brittle. "Ma'am," she said curtly, "you can't hold your baby like that during turbulence. It's against policy." Amara blinked in disbelief. "She's frightened," she whispered, keeping her voice calm. "I'm just trying to comfort her." "Policy," Tiffany snapped, her voice slicing through the hum of the engines. Heads turned. "You need to put the baby in the bassinet, now." Amara hesitated. The bassinet was across the aisle, fixed to the bulkhead, a flimsy cradle in a sea of chaos. Her maternal instinct screamed against it, but Tiffany loomed closer, her shadow falling over them like a storm cloud. "Do it," she said, lips curling. With trembling hands, Amara rose, cradling her baby like a shield. She crossed the aisle, every step heavy with humiliation as passengers watched in silence. She placed her daughter in the bassinet, tucking the pink blanket tightly around her tiny form. The baby whimpered, eyes fluttering open, confusion clouding her innocent gaze. Amara stroked her daughter's cheek, whispering reassurance, when Tiffany's voice cracked like a whip. "Sit down, ma'am. Now." The words hit like a slap. Amara turned, her jaw tightening, but Tiffany was already smirking, arms folded like a queen surveying her conquest. Amara walked back to her seat, her spine rigid, her hands clenched so tight her nails bit into her palms. The passengers whispered again. Laughter, soft but sharp, skimmed the air. Amara sat, staring at the seat back in front of her, every muscle in her body trembling with suppressed rage. She didn't know it yet, but the breaking point was moments away, because Tiffany wasn't finished. An hour later, as the cabin settled into a hush and most passengers dozed, Tiffany returned one last time. Her heels clicked softly against the aisle carpet as she stopped by the bassinet. She adjusted the blanket with exaggerated care, then turned back to Amara with a smirk that dripped with contempt. "Ma'am," she said, her voice carrying in the quiet cabin, "I'm warning you now. If that baby starts crying and disturbs the other passengers, I will have to take action." Amara's breath caught. Take action? Her heart pounded in her ears. Tiffany stepped closer, leaning down until her face hovered inches from Amara's. Her whisper was venomous, meant for no one else to hear. People like you never know their place. The words sliced deeper than any shout. They dredged up every old wound, every moment of judgment and dismissal Amara had endured. Something inside her cracked. She looked up, her eyes burning, not with tears, but with fire. Her voice trembled when she spoke, but her words carried a steel edge. I am done, she whispered. But Tiffany didn't hear, or didn't care. She straightened, her smile razor-sharp, and in one swift motion, her hand lashed out. The crack of skin against skin shattered the silence like thunder. Gasps erupted. A glass clattered to the floor. Amara's head snapped sideways, pain blooming across her cheek. The baby startled awake, wailing in fear. Passengers stared in horror, mouths agape, as the scene froze in stunned disbelief. And Tiffany, her chest heaving, her face twisted in a grotesque parody of triumph, had no idea that her life was about to change forever, because a voice, low and cold as steel, cut through the chaos. Enough. The cabin froze. A sharp, ringing silence settled over first class, broken only by the soft wail of a baby, startled, afraid, and confused. Amara sat rigid, her cheek stinging from the force of Tiffany's slap, her mind reeling from the sheer audacity of what had just happened. Every instinct screamed at her to fight back, to unleash the storm swelling inside her chest. But before a single word left her lips, another voice sliced through the tension, deep, commanding, and laced with an icy calm that made the air vibrate. Enough. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The single word carried the weight of authority that could topple kingdoms. Tiffany's smirk faltered. Smirk. Her head whipped around, eyes darting across the cabin to find the source of that voice. Passengers craned their necks, sensing something monumental unfolding. And then he stood. From the first row of first class, a man rose to his full height, unfolding like a storm cloud ready to blot out the sun. His presence was magnetic, a force that drew every gaze in the cabin. Tall, impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit that spoke of old money and power, his expression was carved from stone. The faintest gleam of a platinum watch caught the overhead lights as his hands flexed at his sides. His eyes, dark, sharp, and utterly unforgiving, locked on Tiffany. The color drained from her face. He began to move, slow and deliberate, each step echoing in the stunned silence. His polished shoes thudded softly against the aisle carpet, the rhythm of inevitability. Tiffany took an involuntary step back, her confidence unraveling thread by thread as he closed the distance. When he stopped, he was a breath away from her. His voice, when it came, was low enough that passengers leaned in to catch every word. "Did you?" he said, each syllable cutting like a blade. "Just put your hands on my wife." Gasps rippled through the cabin. Amara blinked, heart pounding, the words barely registering through the fog of shock. His wife? Tiffany's lips parted soundlessly. She tried for a laugh, a thin, trembling thing. "Sir, I think there's been a misunderstanding." The man's eyes narrowed, silencing her with a single look that could have frozen fire. "No," he said softly, lethally. "There's no misunderstanding." He turned his head slightly, his gaze sweeping the cabin, in a slow arc. Dozens of eyes stared back, wide with disbelief, drinking in every second of the drama. He let the silence stretch, feeding the tension until it thrummed like a live wire. Then, without warning, he pulled a sleek black phone from his jacket pocket. A few swift taps of his thumb, and a name flashed on the screen in bold letters. "Chairman, Global Airways Board." He hit dial. The call connected on the first ring. "This is Robert," he said, his voice calm, cold, and lethal. I need every senior executive in an emergency video conference in 5 minutes. Yes, now, non-negotiable. Tiffany's breath hitched. Her pulse thudded visibly at the base of her throat. She glanced toward the galley, desperate for backup, but her fellow crew members hovered at the edge like frightened deer, unwilling to intervene. Robert ended the call with a flick of his wrist and slid the phone back into his pocket. Then he turned fully to Tiffany, his face a mask of restrained fury. "You just jeopardized a company worth $12 billion, he said, his voice soft enough to make her lean in, but sharp enough to cut through bone. Her eyes widened, the words slamming into her like a physical blow. I don't understand," she stammered. "Oh, you will," Robert replied, his tone as smooth and deadly as black ice. He took another step forward, forcing her back until the edge of the galley pressed into her spine. "You humiliated my wife. You laid hands on her, and you did it on an airline." He paused, his lips curling in a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "That I own." The cabin erupted in a collective gasp. Someone actually dropped a glass, the shatter ringing like a gunshot. Heads whipped toward Amara, toward Robert, then back to Tiffany, whose face had gone the color of paper. "You," she whispered, her voice a tremor. "You own every plane," Robert said. "Every route, every paycheck you've ever cashed." He leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper only she could hear, but the venom in it burned through the air. "And I promise you this, by the time we land, you won't have a career left to crawl back to." Tiffany's knees buckled slightly. Her hands trembled at her sides. Robert straightened, his expression hardening to steel. He turned to the nearest passenger, a man in a navy suit clutching a tablet. "You, record this." The man didn't hesitate. Phones appeared across the cabin, screens glowing like a constellation as passengers scrambled to capture history in the making. Tiffany raised her hands in a feeble gesture, her voice cracking. "Please. I didn't mean—" Robert ignored her. His gaze swept to the other flight attendants, who stood frozen in the galley doorway. "Escort her to the back," he ordered, his tone brooking no argument. "Now!" They moved instantly, seizing Tiffany by the arms. Her protest dissolved into a strangled sob as they dragged her down the aisle past rows of gaping faces. Passengers leaned away as though she were contagious, their whispers a rising tide of disbelief and morbid fascination. When she vanished into the rear cabin, Robert exhaled slowly, then turned back to Amara. She sat motionless, her baby cradled in her arms, eyes wide and shimmering with unshed tears. The sting on her cheek throbbed, but her heart pounded for a different reason now, a wild, disbelieving rush of relief and awe. Robert's face softened as he approached, every line of fury melting into something tender. He crouched beside her, seat, his large hands cupping hers with infinite care. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice low, meant for her alone. Amara swallowed hard, the words tangling in her throat. I'm fine," she whispered, though the tremor in her voice betrayed her. Robert brushed his thumb gently across her cheek, where Tiffany's hand had left its cruel mark. His jaw clenched, the flicker of rage returning. But he kept his voice calm, soothing. "She'll never touch you again," he promised. "No one will." The baby whimpered softly, and Robert's expression shifted into something almost reverent as he reached out, his fingers grazing the tiny fist peeking from the blanket. "Daddy's here," he murmured, his voice breaking on the word. For a long moment, the cabin held its breath, watching this tableau of power and intimacy, a billionaire brought to his knees by love, a woman finally shielded after a storm of humiliation. Cameras clicked quietly, capturing what would soon become a viral legend. Robert rose at last, his commanding presence filling the aisle once more. He turned to face the sea of stunned faces. "This flight continues as scheduled," he announced, his tone brooking no challenge. "But make no mistake, what happened here will have consequences." And then he disappeared into the first-class lounge to prepare for the call that would end one career and send shockwaves through an entire industry. Behind him, whispers erupted like wildfire. Tiffany's name hissed through the air like a curse. Phones buzzed, thumbs flying across screens as the story began its inevitable march toward global headlines. But Amara didn't hear any of it. She sat, cradling her baby, tears finally spilling down her cheeks, not from pain, but from the staggering weight of everything that had just happened. And deep down, she knew this moment would change their lives forever. The rest of the flight moved in stunned silence. Conversations that once buzzed with polite chatter had dwindled to whispers, hushed and electrified, as if every passenger knew they were witnesses to a story that would ripple far beyond this cabin. Amara sat motionless, her baby nestled safely against her chest, eyes fluttering back to sleep. The adrenaline that had burned through her veins now ebbed, leaving her shaky, as though the weight of the last hour had suddenly crashed down on her shoulders. She glanced toward the aisle, where Robert had disappeared moments ago, and felt a swell of gratitude so fierce it threatened to choke her. He hadn't just defended her. He had moved heaven and earth in front of a plane full of strangers to make a statement no one would forget. "You do not humiliate my wife." From the galley, the muffled hum of voices filtered through, crew members speaking in urgent tones. Tiffany had been removed from first class and confined to the rear cabin under strict supervision. A fall from grace so swift and brutal it would become the stuff of whispered legend among flight attendants for years to come. Passengers scrolled, feverishly through their phones, some pretending to mind their own business while slyly capturing snippets of the aftermath. A woman in pearls, who earlier had smirked at Tiffany's cruel performance, now wore an expression of forced neutrality, as though silently rewriting her loyalties. The man with the tablet? He had already posted the first clip on social media. Within minutes, hashtags began trending. Flight attendant meltdown, CEO justice. Powerful Love Robert returned to Amara's side, calm but carrying an energy that hummed like a live wire under his skin. His phone remained in his hand, screen glowing with notifications, emails from board members, texts from executives, frantic calls from PR teams already scrambling to contain a storm they couldn't hope to control. He slid into the seat beside her without a word, his arm curling protectively around her shoulders. For a long, silent moment, he simply held her, his presence a fortress against the chaos swirling around them. She leaned into him, closing her eyes, letting the steady rhythm of his heartbeat soothe the tremors still shivering through her frame. "You, okay?" he murmured finally, his voice low and warm against her ear. She nodded, though the truth was more complicated. She was okay now. But the memory of Tiffany's words, the sting of her palm, the laughter of strangers, they all clung like shadows. Yet here, wrapped in the unwavering strength of the man she loved, those shadows began to recede. Robert pressed a kiss to her temple, lingering there for a beat before pulling back. His eyes, dark, intense, and softened only for her, met hers. "She'll never hurt you again," he said quietly, a vow rather than a promise. Amara swallowed hard, emotion clogging her throat. "I wasn't expecting you to do all that," she whispered, her voice trembling. His jaw tightened, anger flashing like lightning beneath the surface. "I should have done more," he said, his tone harsh, but not toward her, toward himself. "I watched too long before stepping in." "You did enough," she said softly, her fingers brushing his hand. "You did everything." Their eyes locked, and for a moment the cabin, the whispers, the chaos, All of it fell away. There was only them. Then the intercom crackled. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain's voice boomed, calm but edged with gravity. "We've had an incident in the first-class cabin. It has been resolved, and we appreciate your cooperation. Please remain seated as we prepare for landing in approximately 40 minutes. A ripple of murmurs swept the cabin, but no one dared voice what they were all thinking. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The landing, when the wheels kissed the tarmac, tension snapped taut again. Robert remained stone-faced as he gathered. Amara's belongings, his movements clipped and precise. The baby stirred, blinking drowsily as if sensing the shift in energy. Amara kissed her forehead, whispering soothing words, though her own pulse thundered like a drumbeat in her ears. The seatbelt sign dimmed. Passengers rose in a flurry, stretching, reaching for luggage, but their eyes never stopped darting toward Robert and Amara. Phones glowed like stars, some blatantly recording, others pretending to scroll. They were watching history unfold, and they knew it. When Robert stood, the entire aisle seemed to part instinctively, a silent acknowledgement of power, raw, unspoken, and absolute. He held out his hand to Amara. She placed her smaller one in his, rising with the grace of a queen escorted from a battlefield. As they stepped into the jet bridge, the chill of reality swept in. Two uniformed airline supervisors flanked by security. Officers waited at the gate, faces pale with dread. Behind them, Tiffany appeared, escorted in disgrace, her once impeccable hair in disarray, her eyes swollen from tears. The arrogance that had dripped from her like venom hours earlier was gone, stripped bare, leaving only a hollow shell of disbelief and ruin. She opened her mouth, perhaps to plead, perhaps to explain, but Robert didn't even glance her way. His hand remained firm on Amara's as he guided her past without a flicker of acknowledgement. For Tiffany, that silent dismissal was worse than any shouted condemnation. The fallout outside the terminal, chaos bloomed like wildfire. Paparazzi. Cameras flashed. Reporters shoved microphones forward, their questions tumbling over one another in a frenzied chorus. "Mr. Whitaker, is it true you personally fired the flight attendant? Mrs. Whitaker, how do you feel about what happened on board? Will there be a lawsuit against Global Airways?" Robert shielded Amara with his body as they strode through the gauntlet of flashing lights, his security team forming an impenetrable wall around them. He didn't answer a single question. But the look in his eyes, the storm coiled tight, the promise of reckoning, spoke louder than any words. By the time they slid into the back seat of a waiting black SUV, the incident had already gone viral. News alerts pinged across the globe. Social media exploded with videos, hashtags, and outrage. Flight attendant assaults passenger, turns out she's married to airline CEO. Power move, billionaire husband defends wife after mid-flight. Humiliation. Justice for Amara trends worldwide. Within hours, Tiffany's name trended for all the wrong reasons. Her photograph, once pristine and polished, circulated online alongside captions dripping with condemnation. Former colleagues crawled out of the woodwork, sharing stories of her arrogance, her cruelty, her sense of untouchable superiority. But the real hammer fell when Global Airways released an official statement. "We do not tolerate discrimination or abuse of any kind." Effective immediately, the employee involved has been terminated. Further, mandatory sensitivity and inclusion training will be implemented across all staff. To Mrs. Amara Whitaker and her family, we extend our deepest apologies. The statement ignited another firestorm, but this time it wasn't about outrage, it was about accountability. And for once, the internet applauded. The private reckoning back in their penthouse, as the city glittered below like a jeweled ocean, Robert poured 2 glasses of wine, though Amara barely touched hers. She sat curled on the velvet sofa, her baby asleep in the nursery, her body still humming with the aftershocks of the day. Robert joined her, his tall frame folding into the cushions beside her. He studied her for a long moment, his eyes softening as they traced the faint shadow of Tiffany's hand still ghosting her cheek. "I should have been there sooner," he said quietly, guilt darkening his tone. Amara shook her head. "You were there when it mattered." His jaw clenched. "No one touches you. No one humiliates you. Ever." His voice dropped, dangerous and low. "If I hadn't stepped in—" "But you did," she whispered, reaching for his hand. "And that's all that matters." For a beat, the only sound was the distant hum of the city beyond the glass walls. Then Robert pulled her into his arms, holding her as though anchoring himself to the one thing in his empire that truly mattered. And for the first time that day, Amara let herself believe it was over. Not because justice had been served, but because she had someone who would burn the world to keep her safe. The world watches. In the weeks that followed, the story refused to die. News outlets dissected it. Talk shows debated it. Hashtags sparked conversations about race, privilege, and power in ways that rippled far beyond a single flight. For Amara, the attention was overwhelming. But Robert handled it with the precision of a man who controlled billion-dollar deals before breakfast. He shielded her from the worst of it, declined interviews, and funneled the noise into something that mattered: change. Global Airways announced sweeping reforms, employee training, diversity programs, anonymous reporting systems. Robert made sure Tiffany's name became a cautionary tale in every corporate handbook. Power without empathy is a ticket to ruin. And through it all, Amara found her voice. Not on social media, not in interviews, but in quiet conversations. In advocacy work, Robert helped her spearhead, ensuring no other woman endured what she had on that plane. The takeaway, months later, on a sun-drenched balcony overlooking the ocean. Amara held her daughter close as Robert wrapped his arms around them both. The world had moved on, but the lesson lingered like a scar carved deep into memory. Power could buy luxury, status, even fear, but respect, that wasn't earned by titles or money. It was rooted in something far stronger: human decency. And, for those who forgot that truth, karma had a way of delivering reminders, sometimes softly, sometimes with a slap that echoed across the skies.